If you're lying comfortably right now, wrapped in clean sheets, breathing air that doesn't demand effort, I want you to pause for a moment before sleep takes you and imagine all of that quietly disappearing. Imagine your mattress turning into damp straw, your warm room shrinking into a low, smoke-blackened chamber, and the air around you becoming so thick and foul that people once said you could smell the city of Edinburgh from 15 miles away on a windy day. This is Edinburgh, in the early 1700s, a city of more than 50,000 people crushed into a space smaller than many modern neighbourhoods. A city with nowhere left to expand except upward, where buildings climbed 14 stories into the sky, and human lives stacked one on top of another, breathing the same stale air, sharing the same darkness, and surviving day by day inside one of the most crowded urban spaces in Europe. Tonight, this isn't a story about kings or philosophers or grand battles, but about survival, about what it actually meant to live here, to wake up here, to endure this city without plumbing, without heating, without privacy, and without certainty. So take a slow breath, settle in, and let the modern world fade away, because the air of 18th century Edinburgh will not be kind. Forget for a moment what comfort means. Forget running water. Forget bathing as a routine. Forget clean streets and quiet nights, because when your eyes open again, you are no longer in your own time. You wake up in Edinburgh. The ceiling above you is low, stained black by decades of coal smoke and cooking fires, the wooden beams dark and greasy with age, and the light that filters into the room comes through a window no larger than your hand, its glass cracked and stuffed with rags to keep out the wind, though the cold still finds its way in regardless. Your name is Jamie. You are 16 years old, and you are an apprentice to a wigmaker on the high street. The cold is the first thing you feel, not the clean, sharp cold of the countryside, but a damp, penetrating chill that has settled into your bones while you slept, creeping up from the stone walls and the packed earth floor beneath you. The blanket covering you is little more than a rough piece of wool, stiff with the smell of everyone who slept beneath it before you, and before them, because nothing here truly belongs to one person alone. You share this room with 3 other apprentices, all of you sleeping on straw pallets that haven't been changed in months, straw that crunches when you move and hides insects and vermin you've learned not to think about too closely. This is where your day begins. The second thing you notice, once the cold has settled into you properly, is the smell. It's important to understand that your nose has adjusted to this over time, not because it's gone away, but because the human body learns to endure what it cannot escape. The smell is layered. On top of everything else is smoke, coal smoke and wood smoke, rising from thousands of fires burning in thousands of rooms across the old town, trapped between tall tenements packed so tightly together that you could lean out of a window and touch the building opposite. Beneath that is the smell of unwashed bodies, including your own, because you haven't had what anyone would call a proper bath in months, and neither has anyone else. Bathing being widely believed to weaken the body, to open the pores to bad air and invite disease, a dangerous luxury best avoided if you want to stay alive. And beneath all of that, always present, is something darker: human waste. There is no plumbing here, no toilets, no running water, only a shared chamber pot beneath your pallet, emptied once a day if you're lucky, and emptied the traditional way through a window, with a shouted warning of gardez-vous, a corrupted French phrase meaning watch out below, though what falls into the narrow closes is anything but water. At night and early in the morning, windows across the city open, and the contents of thousands of chamber pots arc down into the streets, splashing against stone, soaking the ground, and occasionally hitting the unlucky soul who happened to be walking beneath. The city council has talked for years about regulating it, about fines and schedules and order, but nothing has changed and the filth keeps falling. You try not to think about that yet. You're thinking about getting up quietly, about the long day ahead, about the fact that your stomach has been empty since the thin bowl of oatmeal porridge you ate last night. You swing your legs off the pallet, the floor icy against your bare feet. the rush is beneath you, long overdue for replacement, and you pull on your shoes quickly, while the other apprentices stir in their sleep, coughing, muttering, shifting under their own thin blankets. Above you are 9 more floors of humanity. Below you, 4 floors of people just as poor as you are, and beneath them, in dark cellars that never see sunlight, those with even less. This is Edinburgh, and this is how survival begins. Cold, hungry, and surrounded by stone. You move carefully now, easing the door open so it doesn't creak too loudly, because sound travels in places like this, slipping through cracks in wood and stone, the way smoke slips through chimneys, and waking the others too early only earns you curses and resentment you don't have the energy to deal with before dawn. The narrow stone staircase outside your room coils downward through the building like the inside of a shell, worn smooth in the center by centuries of feet, slick with moisture and things you deliberately refuse to examine too closely in the half-light, and as you begin your descent you grip the wall with one hand, not for balance so much as reassurance, because a fall here would not be dramatic or heroic, just a broken neck and a body found hours later when someone needed to pass. As you go down, door after door slides past you, thin wooden barriers separating entire lives by little more than planks and habit, and behind them you hear everything. A baby crying in one room, a man and woman arguing bitterly in another, their voices echoing up the stairwell as they fight about bread, about money, about promises made and broken. The same arguments repeated endlessly in every language and every century. The smell grows worse the lower you go. By the time you reach street level, it's no longer just something you notice, but something you feel, thick and heavy in your lungs. A physical presence that clings to your clothes and hair no matter how much you wish it wouldn't. The close opens in front of you, barely wide enough for 2 people to pass without turning sideways. The stone walls rising on either side like cliffs, upper stories jutting outward so far that they almost touch overhead, blocking out what little sky there might have been. The cobblestones beneath your feet are coated in a layer of filth that defies description. A mixture of horse dung, human waste, food scraps, and things you step around without looking too closely, because learning to look is a mistake people don't make twice. And yet, life goes on. A woman steps out of a doorway carrying a bucket, nods at you as she passes, and you nod back, because even here, especially here, small gestures of recognition matter. A dog noses through a pile of refuse near the mouth of the close, pausing to look up at you with yellow eyes before returning to its work. And somewhere above, a window opens, followed immediately by a shouted warning that makes you quicken your pace instinctively. The close spills you out onto the high street, and suddenly the world feels wider, louder, more alive. The Royal Mile stretches out before you, running from the castle high on its volcanic rock down toward Holyrood Palace, the ancient spine of the city, already stirring with movement even at this early hour. Merchants opening their booths, fishwives shouting prices with voices sharpened by years of cold air and hard living, water carriers staggering under the weight of buckets balanced on yokes across their shoulders. A sedan chair pushes through the crowd, carried by 2 broad-shouldered Highlanders, the passenger hidden behind curtains, spared the filth and chaos below by wealth alone, and you flatten yourself against a wall to let them pass, watching them go with a mixture of resentment and awe. Above it all, the castle looms, 300 feet of dark stone rising out of the city like a clenched fist, its walls scarred by centuries of conflict, the Union flag flying from its highest tower, a constant reminder that Scotland is no longer ruled from here, that power now sits far to the south, and that this city lives under watchful eyes. Politics, however, is a luxury you can sit afford. Your master's shop lies halfway down the high street, and as you reach it and duck inside, the smell changes immediately, replaced by something almost pleasant, powder and horsehair and glue. The controlled smells of craft and work, a small island of order in a city that thrives on disorder. Mr. Crawford is already there. He stands hunched over a workbench, compact and sharp-eyed, his own wig sitting slightly askew, which is never a good sign because it means he dressed in haste, and haste usually means displeasure. "You sit late," he says, without looking up. You glance at the window, at the pale light barely breaking over the rooftops. But there's no point arguing, because time belongs to those with power, and you don't have any. He rattles off the day's demands without pausing for breath. 3 orders due before nightfall, a repair for a minor lord, a new piece for an advocate, something modern for a young professor who fancies himself forward-thinking, and by modern he means slightly less ridiculous than what his father wears. You tie on your apron and take your place at the preparation bench, because as the youngest apprentice your work is the lowest, cleaning and combing horsehair, mixing powder, doing the tasks that must be done before the real work can begin. The hair comes from dead horses bought from knackers, men who deal in animals nobody else wants, and as you sort it you sometimes find things mixed in that you'd rather not. Bits of dried flesh, insects, once even a small dead mouse, and you learn very quickly not to let these discoveries slow you down. This is how skills are passed down here. 7 years of unpaid labour in exchange for knowledge, 7 years of thin meals and cramped rooms, 7 years of doing what you're told and surviving long enough to become something more than you were. And as your hands move through motions you've repeated 1,000 times already, the city outside continues its endless, filthy, magnificent dance, and you focus on your work because for now survival is enough. The morning settles into a rhythm the way it always does, quietly and without ceremony, marked not by clocks but by the ache in your hands, the dull pull in your shoulders, and the slow realization that hours have passed without you noticing. Because work in a place like this doesn't ask for your attention so much as it consumes it. Horsehair slides between your fingers, coarse and stubborn, resisting the comb at first before slowly yielding, strand by strand, until it lies smooth and obedient on the bench, ready to be shaped into something respectable enough to sit on the head of a man who will never think about where it came from, or whose hands prepared it. The powder you mix turns your skin pale and chalky, clinging to every crease of your fingers and settling into your nails, and you already know it won't fully wash out for days, no matter how hard you scrub, because nothing here ever truly leaves. It only layers itself on top of what was already there. Around you the shop fills. Journeymen take their places at the main benches, men who have finished their 7 years and earned the right to be paid for their skill, their movements confident and precise, hands shaping curls and lines, with an ease that comes only from repetition and time, while Mr. Crawford moves between them, inspecting, criticizing, occasionally offering a sharp nod that passes for praise. Customers drift in and out. Advocates in black coats and powdered wigs, smelling faintly of ink and importance. Doctors with serious faces who believe their education sets them apart from the chaos of the city. Minor gentry who speak loudly and expect to be heard, all of them united by the unspoken agreement that appearance matters, that authority looks a certain way, and that a proper wig helps convince the world you belong where you stand. By mid-morning, your stomach has begun to gnaw at itself, a hollow ache that sharpens every smell drifting in from the street. Bread baking somewhere nearby, fish being cleaned at a stall farther down the high street, the faint sweetness of ale already spilling from taverns that opened too early or never really closed. You try not to think about food. Thinking doesn't make it appear. When Mr. Crawford finally sends you out on an errand, the relief is immediate, not because the streets are kinder than the shop, but because movement feels like freedom, even when it's temporary. The advocates' chambers lie near Parliament Close, in a building that once housed the old Scottish Parliament before the Union stripped it of purpose. And as you approach, the stone architecture grows more imposing, columns and wide steps meant to communicate power and permanence, even as the city around it threatens to crumble under its own weight. You deliver the wig to a servant who looks down at you with practiced disdain, his nose lifted just enough to remind you that even among those with little hierarchies are carefully maintained, because believing you're better than someone else is sometimes the only thing keeping you upright. On your way back, you pass through the grass market. The space opens up suddenly after the narrow closes, wide by Edinburgh standards, sitting in the hollow below the castle rock, used for markets, for livestock and for executions. Though the gallows aren't standing today, stored away until they're needed again. Everyone knows this place. Everyone knows what happens here when the scaffold is raised. You've seen it twice already in your short time in the city. Crowds packed shoulder to shoulder, vendors selling pies and ale, children hoisted onto shoulders for a better view, and men dying in front of thousands while the city watches, fascinated and repulsed in equal measure. Justice, you have learned, isn't sip quiet. It's such loud, public, and meant to be remembered. You hurry through the square, past the spot where the gallows usually stand, and begin the climb back toward the high street, your legs burning slightly with the effort, strong now in a way they never were when you first arrived, because Edinburgh reshapes the body as surely as it reshapes the mind. For a moment, the smoke thins. The sun breaks through the haze just enough to reveal Arthur's Seat in the distance, rising green and wild beyond the city walls, untouched by the filth and noise below, and you think about the countryside you came from, about the farm you left behind, about a mother who may still be alive or may not, because letters cost money and silence is cheaper. You came here because you had no choice. A third son inherits nothing. Your options were few, and this one, hard as it is, still beats starvation. When you duck back into a close and begin the familiar climb up the stairwell toward the shop, the city closes around you again, stone and shadow and smell, and you realize something without quite meaning to. You are becoming part of it. Your lungs have adapted to the air, your legs to the stairs, your senses to things that would have once made you gag or flee, and though you would never say it out loud, Edinburgh is shaping you into one of its own. The afternoon stretches ahead. There is more hair to prepare, more powder to mix, more quiet endurance required, and as you take your place back at the bench, hands moving automatically through familiar motions, the city outside continues, loud and crowded and indifferent. For now, you work. Because in 1700s, Edinburgh survival isn't dramatic. It's repetitive. And repetition is how you stay alive. By the time the light begins to tilt and soften against the stone outside the shop windows, your hands ache in a way that feels deeper than muscle, a tiredness that settles into the joints and stays there, reminding you that this city takes its payment slowly, over years rather than all at once. Mr. Crawford finally steps back from the main bench, examines the day's work with narrowed eyes, and gives a short nod that means the orders will do, which is the closest thing to approval you're likely to receive, before waving you and the other apprentices away with a reminder that tomorrow will be worse, because there is always more to do tomorrow. You step back onto the high street as evening gathers, and Edinburgh changes its face. The daylight crowds thin and shift, merchants packing away their goods, replaced by labourers heading home, servants running last errands, men drifting toward taverns with coins clutched tightly in their fists, each one calculating how much warmth and forgetfulness a few pence can buy. The shadows stretch long across the cobblestones, the upper stories of the tenements blocking the sky until the street feels like a canyon carved from stone, and the smells intensify as fires are lit for the night, smoke mixing with everything else until it becomes part of the air itself. Malcolm falls into step beside you without warning. He's the eldest of the apprentices, 19 and already hardened in ways you're only beginning to understand, his frame lean but wiry, his eyes sharp with the restless energy of someone who isn't content to endure forever. "I got a few pennies," he says. Casual, like it doesn't matter, though you both know it does. Enough for a drink. You hesitate only briefly. Mistress Crawford locks the door at 10, and the thought of something warm in your stomach, something that isn't thin porridge, outweighs the risks. The tavern lies down close off the cannon gate, the stone passage narrowing as you descend, the sound of voices growing louder before you even reach the door. Inside, the ceiling is low and dark, smoke from a peat fire clinging to everything, pipe smoke layering over it. The floor-packed earth scattered with sawdust and rushes, damp and spongy underfoot. The smell is unmistakable: spilled ale, sweat, damp wool, and something cooking in the back that you don't ask about too closely. Malcolm orders 2 pints of small beer. It's weak, barely strong enough to make you dizzy, but that's the point because it's safer than water and fills the hollow spaces in your stomach better than bread alone. You drink half of it in one swallow, the bitterness sharp and oddly comforting, the cold liquid easing something tight inside you. Around you, the tavern fills steadily. Brewery workers with stained hands, tanners who smell permanently of their trade, sailors up from Leith with sea salt still clinging to their coats, and a few men in better clothes whose wigs sit slightly askew after a long day, pretending authority means something in a city that ignores it. Here, class blurs a little. Money still matters, but everyone drinks from the same cups, eats the same thin broth when it arrives unasked, and listens to the same scraped fiddle when a musician finally takes the corner and begins to play. The food appears on the table, a bowl of broth with bits of gristle floating in it, a heel of bread hard enough to demand effort, and you eat without comment, because hunger doesn't require conversation. Malcolm leans back after a while, watching the room in a way that tells you his mind isn't on the music. "You hear what happened at the castle this morning?" he asks quietly. You shake your head. "They set for bringing in more soldiers," he says. "Redcoats, more than before." That gets your attention. The garrison is already heavy, the castle bristling with men and guns meant to remind Edinburgh who really holds power, and the idea that it might grow even larger sends a small chill through you. "Why?" you ask. Malcolm shrugs, but his eyes are bright in a way that suggests he knows more than he's saying. "People are talking," he says, "about the prince." You glance around the room instinctively. Conversations continue. Laughter rises and falls, but everyone in Edinburgh knows that walls listen, and words spoken too freely can find their way to ears you never intended to reach. Charles Edward Stuart. The name isn't spoken loudly. Not here, not now, but it hangs over the city like a half-remembered song, passed quietly from mouth to mouth, tied to dreams of old kings and lost independence, and the dangerous idea that things might be different. "My uncle was out in the 15, Malcolm adds after a moment. "Lost 3 fingers at Sheriff Moir. You didn't know that." He doesn't set talk about his family much, still sings the old songs when he sits drunk. Malcolm says, almost smiling, "The ones you sit not supposed to sing anymore." You don't stand respond. You don't need to. The fiddle plays faster, the room grows louder, and for a brief while it's possible to forget the cold stone walls and the crowded staircases, and the knowledge that tomorrow will be exactly the same as today. Then the door opens. Cold night air cuts through the warmth, and a man in a red coat steps inside. The room doesn't fall silent, not exactly, but the sound shifts, conversations lowering, laughter tightening at the edges, eyes flicking toward the uniform before looking away again. The soldier orders a drink and sits near the fire, alone, his accent unmistakably English, far from home in a city that watches him with equal parts resentment and fear. He isn't set doing anything wrong, but his presence changes everything. Malcolm stands abruptly. "Time to go," he says. You don't argue. Outside, the streets are darker now, the high street lit only by scattered lanterns and the glow of fires behind windows, shadows pooling in the closes where footpads wait and link boys guide drunken gentlemen for a few pennies. You walk quickly, hands visible, head down, Malcolm beside you, his reputation enough to discourage most trouble. As you climb back toward the shop, the city hums around you, voices drifting through thin walls, footsteps echoing on stone, the sound of a place that never truly rests. And as you reach the familiar door and slip inside before it's locked for the night, you feel it again, that quiet, uneasy sense that something is moving beneath the surface of Edinburgh, something waiting for the right moment to break through. For now, though, you climb the stairs, lie down on your pallet, and listen to the city breathe. Tomorrow will come. It always does. Sleep in Edinburgh never arrives cleanly or all at once, not the way it might in a quiet village or a modern room sealed off from the world, but in fragments, in shallow stretches broken by sound and movement, and the constant reminder that you are never truly alone in a building packed with hundreds of other lives stacked above and below you. You lie on your straw pallet staring into the darkness, listening as the city settles around you, the old timbers creaking as they cool, the stone walls holding the day's warmth just long enough to make the night feel damp rather than cold, and somewhere nearby, always nearby, someone coughing in a way that makes you tense without quite knowing why. Duncan Sipp's cough has been getting worse. At first it was nothing, just a dry rasp in the mornings that he laughed off, a harmless irritation from smoke and dust, and the bad air everyone breathes. But now it has depth to it, a wet sound that seems to come from somewhere too far inside him. And when he coughs in the night, you can hear the effort it takes, the way his chest struggles to push the air out. You turn onto your side and watch him in the faint light coming through the window. His face looks thinner than it did a month ago, his cheeks hollowing slightly, his skin taking on a greyish cast that doesn't belong to a healthy 16-year-old boy. And you think about how many people you've seen like this since coming to Edinburgh, how many have coughed and faded, and eventually disappeared, their places taken by new apprentices, new servants, new bodies to fill the space. Illness is everywhere here. It moves through tenements the way rumours do, quietly and without respect for walls or doors, carried on breath and shared cups and damp straw. And when it takes hold, there is very little anyone can do but wait and hope it chooses someone else next. By morning, Duncan is worse. He tries to sit up and fails, his breath coming short and shallow, sweat slicking his skin despite the chill in the room. And when Malcolm swears under his breath and tells you to stay with him while he goes to fetch Mr. Crawford, you know what that means. A sick apprentice is a problem, not a tragedy, not yet, but an inconvenience, something that disrupts the careful balance of work and profit and routine. And whether Duncan lives or dies will depend less on care than on whether keeping him alive is considered worth the effort. Mr. Crawford stands in the doorway a few minutes later, already dressed for the day, his wig neatly powdered, his expression tight as he looks down at Duncan's shaking form. He sit or need an apothecary, you say. Mr. Crawford exhales slowly through his nose, the sound of a man doing sums in his head, weighing cost against obligation, and finally nods once. After church, he says. Until then, keep him warm, give him water if he can take it. Then he's gone, leaving you alone in the room with Duncan and the quiet realization that in this city, timing matters almost as much as money and sometimes more. You fetch water from the well at the bottom of the close, carrying it up flight after flight, your arms burning by the time you reach the 5th floor, because even something as simple as a drink of water is work here, effort layered on effort, until exhaustion becomes normal. When you return, Duncan manages a few sips before coughing again, his body curling inward as if trying to protect something fragile inside his chest. And you sit with him, counting his breaths without meaning to, listening to the way the sound changes from one hour to the next. Outside, the bells begin to ring. Sunday. The whole city responds. Doors opening, people filing down staircases in their best coats, because the kirk watches, and in Edinburgh faith is enforced not just by belief, but by neighbours, elders, and the quiet threat of public shame. You don't, it's go. You stay with Duncan, knowing it will be noticed, knowing someone will remember, but also knowing that leaving him alone feels worse than whatever consequences might come later. From the window, you can see across the rooftops the dense sprawl of stone and slate stretching eastward, church spires rising like fingers pointing toward a sky that rarely feels kind, and beyond the city, just visible through the haze, Arthur's Seat stands green and distant, a reminder that not everything in the world is crowded and foul and pressing in on itself. For a moment you imagine walking there, breathing air that doesn't taste like smoke, standing somewhere high enough to see the city as a whole rather than as a series of walls and staircases and narrow passages. It feels like another life. The apothecary arrives in the afternoon, a thin man with spectacles and a leather bag full of bottles and powders. his manner practiced and detached, as if sick boys blur together after a while. He examines Duncan quickly, checking his pulse, peering at his tongue, asking questions that seem random and oddly specific, then straightens and delivers his verdict without ceremony. Fever, he says. Keep him warm. Broth, if possible. This tincture twice a day. You ask if Duncan will live. The apothecary shrugs. God decides that. And then he's gone, leaving behind a bottle that smells sharp and unpleasant in a room that feels suddenly much smaller. That evening, there sips a knock at the door. A young woman stands there, carrying a small bundle wrapped in cloth, her dark hair tucked beneath a simple cap, her eyes steady in a way that surprises you. My mistress has herbs, she says quietly, for fever. You hesitate, because nothing in Edinburgh is ever offered freely. But something in her expression tells you this isn't a bargain. Thank you, you say, taking the bundle carefully. My name sips Agnes, she adds. I work on the 3rd floor. You tell her your name. She glances past you at Duncan, lying pale and still on his pallet, and nods once, as if confirming something she already knew. I'd certain come back tomorrow, she says. Tell me if they help. When she leaves, the stairwell seems quieter than before. You make the tea from the herbs, the smell sharp and green, so different from the city that for a moment it feels like standing in a field rather than a tenement. And when Duncan drinks it, his breathing eases just enough to let you hope. Night falls again. You sit by the pallet, half asleep, half awake, listening to the city breathe through stone and wood, aware that in rooms all around you other people are sitting with their own sick, their own fears, their own quiet calculations about survival. And as exhaustion finally pulls you under, you understand something important. In 1700s Edinburgh, survival isn't just about strength or luck or skill. It's about who notices you when you sit weak. Duncan does not die that night, which in a city like Edinburgh already feels like a kind of victory, even if it's too early to say it out loud, even if hope is something you've learned to handle carefully, the way you'd handle a blade, aware that it can cut you if you grip it too tightly. His fever breaks slowly, not all at once, but in stages, sweat soaking the straw beneath him, his breathing easing from that frightening rasp into something closer to normal, and by morning his eyes are clearer, focused again, the fog lifting just enough that he can recognize you when you speak his name. You stay with him as much as you can, taking turns with William, bringing water, coaxing him to drink broth when Mistress Crawford reluctantly allows it, and steeping Agnes's herbs again and again until the room smells faintly of something green and living, a reminder that the world beyond stone and smoke still exists somewhere. Agnes comes back the next day, just as she said she would. She stands in the doorway quietly, her hands folded in front of her, scanning Duncan's face with the practiced eye of someone who has seen sickness up close and lived through it. And when you tell her that his breathing is better, that the fever has eased, she allows herself a small nod, not quite a smile, but something close to it. My grandmother swore by those herbs, she says, said they don't set cure, exactly, but they give the body a chance. In Edinburgh, chances are rare. You walk her partway down the stairs, stopping on the 3rd floor landing, the place where conversations linger just long enough to feel private before the sounds of the building intrude again, and for a moment neither of you speaks, listening to footsteps above and below, to voices drifting through doors too thin to keep secrets. Thank you. You say again because it still feels inadequate, but it's all you have. She shrugs lightly. Someone helped me once. It sets how things survive here. Not people, you think. Things, kindness, habits, small gestures passed from one person to another like contraband, unnoticed by those in power. By the end of the week, Duncan can sit up on his own. By the end of the second, he's standing weak and shaking, but alive. And Mr. Crawford nods once when he sees him at the bench again, already calculating how quickly the disruption has ended, how soon things can return to normal. Normal in Edinburgh is never comfortable. Work resumes its steady pace. Your hands return to their routines, combing horsehair, mixing powder, preparing forms, And as the days shorten and the light fades earlier each afternoon, the city begins to shift again, not visibly, not dramatically, but in the way people speak, in the way they lower their voices when certain names come up, in the way glances linger just a moment too long on red-coated soldiers passing through the high street. Rumours are moving. You hear them first in taverns, whispered between cups of weak beer, carried by men who lean in close and check the door before speaking. Stories of a prince across the water, a Stuart prince, young and restless, gathering support in France, backed by men who believe the crown still belongs to his family. The stories contradict each other. Some say he's reckless, all charm and ambition with no understanding of war. Others say he's dangerous precisely because people believe in him, because belief has a way of turning ordinary men into something more. Malcolm listens more closely than most. You see it in the way his eyes sharpen when the rumours surface, in the way he asks careful questions that don't sound like questions at all, in the way he grows restless at the bench, his hands moving too fast, his mind clearly elsewhere. One evening, after work, you find him waiting for you at the foot of the stairs. "Walk with me," he says, already turning toward the street. You follow. The city feels different at dusk now, charged in a way that has nothing to do with light or weather, and as you pass taverns spilling laughter and argument into the street, you realize that Edinburgh has begun to hold its breath. "Something sep's coming," Malcolm says quietly, as if giving shape to a thought you said been avoiding. You can feel it, can set you. You don't answer right away. You can feel it. Everyone can. The soldiers in the castle drill longer hours. The city guard watches more closely. Men talk about loyalties as if they're things you can choose and discard at will, as if choosing wrong won't get you killed. Agnes notices it too. You see her more often now, not because circumstances have changed, but because uncertainty pushes people together. And on the third-floor landing between errands and borrowed moments, you talk in low voices about nothing and everything, about Duncan's recovery, about work, about how the city feels tighter than it did a month ago, as if the stone itself is bracing for impact. "My mistress burns letters now," Agnes says one evening, her voice barely above a whisper. "Anything from abroad, anything that could be misunderstood." That word again. Misunderstood. In a city where misunderstanding can mean prison, or worse. You don't know what to say to that. So you stand there with her in the half-light, close enough to feel the warmth of another person through layers of wool, close enough to imagine briefly what it might be like to belong somewhere other than here. Winter presses in, the cold sharpens. The smells retreat just enough to be replaced by something worse, the stagnant odour of frozen waste and damp stone. And as snow threatens to fall, you realise that surviving Edinburgh isn't just about enduring what is, but about bracing for what's coming next. And whatever it is, the city already knows it's on the way. Winter does not arrive in Edinburgh with drama or announcement, but with a gradual tightening, a slow closing of the city's grip, as if the stone itself contracts in the cold and pulls everyone inward, closer together, until privacy becomes a memory and warmth. Something to be negotiated rather than expected. The first frost comes overnight. You feel it immediately when you wake. The air sharper, cleaner in a way that doesn't feel kind. The breath of everyone in the room visible now. Faint clouds rising and dissolving in the half-light. And the straw beneath you stiff with cold where dampness has crept in and frozen. Duncan coughs once, then stops, his body still weak but holding. And you allow yourself a quiet moment of relief before the day presses in again. Outside, the high street has changed. The smells are muted now, locked beneath ice and frost, replaced by something metallic and dry, and footsteps ring louder against frozen stone, every sound carrying farther in the cold air. People move faster, they speak less. Winter in Edinburgh is not a season for lingering. Work becomes harder. Horsehair snaps more easily in the cold powder clumps. If it isn't kept dry, glue thickens and resists, and tempers shorten, as hands lose feeling and mistakes become more frequent. Mr. Crawford grows sharper, quicker to scold, because deadlines don't soften for weather, and customers still expect perfection even as their own fingers go numb beneath fine gloves. Food becomes more precious. Bread is smaller now, loaves cut thinner to stretch supplies, broth watered down just enough that you notice, but not enough to complain, and every meal feels like something that might not be replaced if missed. You learn to eat slowly, not to savor, but to make it last. In the evenings, the city draws inward. Taverns fill earlier, fires burning hotter, men crowding close not just for drink but for warmth, and conversations grow quieter, more focused the way they do when uncertainty hangs heavy. It's there, pressed between bodies and low ceilings, that the rumors sharpen, not whispers anymore. Names are spoken more openly now, not loudly but without the same instinctive fear, as if repetition has dulled the danger just enough to make people careless. The prince has landed, someone says. In the Highlands, someone else insists. Plans are gathering, money is moving, men are choosing sides. You listen without speaking, because listening costs nothing, and saying the wrong thing can cost everything. Malcolm changes. Not suddenly, not in any single dramatic way, but in small details that add up. The way he stands a little straighter, the way he watches soldiers pass with something close to challenge in his eyes, the way he disappears some evenings and returns late, smelling of smoke and cold rather than ale. One night, as snow begins to fall, light and dry, dusting the city in white that almost makes it look clean, he waits for you again at the foot of the stairs. "I sit him leaving," he says. The words land heavily between you. "When you ask." "Soon," he replies. "Before it sets too late." Too late for what? He doesn't say. And you don't ask because you already know. "You could come," he adds. Quieter now. They need men, not soldiers, just men who can walk and carry and keep their mouths shut. You picture it without meaning to. The Highlands, cold and open, camps by firelight, danger that announces itself instead of creeping up through walls and lungs. A life where the enemy is visible. You also picture the shop, the bench, Duncan's pale face when the fever took him, Agnes on the third-floor landing, the fragile network of routines and favours that keep you alive. "I can sit," you say finally. Malcolm nods. He doesn't look disappointed. He looks relieved, as if your answer frees him from something he didn't want to say aloud. "Someone has to stay," he says. "Someone has to remember what this place was like." He leaves before dawn 2 days later. No farewell. Just an empty pallet and the knowledge that something irreversible has happened, not just for him but for the city itself. Snow thickens. The castle guns are cleaned and repositioned. Patrols increase. Doors close earlier. Agnes tells you her mistress has begun hiding valuables beneath floorboards, not because she knows anything for certain, but because fear has its own logic. And as you walk the high street one evening, watching flakes of snow swirl between the towering buildings, you realize that Edinburgh is no longer just surviving. It's bracing. For now, you keep working. You keep your head down. You keep breathing air that bites and burns and reminds you that you're alive. But somewhere beyond the walls, men are marching, and soon enough, the city will have to choose whether it wants to be a witness or a battlefield. Winter shows its true face, not through falling snow or sudden cold, but through absence, through the quiet realization that things which once existed without question are no longer there. At first in ways so subtle you almost miss them, and then more clearly, until one morning you wake and understand that the city is no longer functioning as it once did, not because of a single dramatic event, but because every small certainty has been worn thin by time and pressure. Bread is the first thing that changes, not in taste but in size, because the bakers still work their ovens, but flour is scarcer now, and each loaf is cut thinner and weighed more carefully, and when you hold it in your hand you feel the difference immediately, not because your stomach is emptier than it was yesterday, but because your mind begins to accept that this is not temporary, that this is not a bad week to be endured, but a slow direction the city is slipping into without the strength to stop itself. Along the high street, faces grow more closed and guarded. People pause less often to speak, and conversations that once drifted freely now end abruptly when a stranger approaches, because rumours have gained weight and consequences, and every word spoken feels as though it might settle somewhere unseen, waiting to be remembered and repeated later by someone you never intended to hear it. Inside the workshop, Mr. Crawford works longer hours and speaks less, and when he does speak it is in that low, precise voice that allows no misunderstanding, because orders must be delivered regardless of cold, regardless of shortages, regardless of the fact that some customers now pay late or not at all, and for the first time you sense that this trade, which once felt like an anchor and a promise of stability, is as fragile as everything else in the city. Duncan remains on his feet, but he has changed, thinner and quieter, and although the cough has not returned, it has left behind a new caution in him, as if his body learned something it will never forget. And when he climbs the stairs he measures each step carefully, stopping at times without comment, resting against the wall until his breath returns to him. Agnes becomes a more constant presence, not because anything has been spoken or agreed between you, but because in uncertain times people are drawn to those who ask nothing in return, and your conversations remain brief and fragmented, about the weather, about work, about who has moved away, who has vanished, who has not been seen for several days, because in Edinburgh disappearance is not an event but a process, someone present one day and simply absent the next, without the city feeling any obligation to explain. Soldiers are everywhere now, not aggressively, and not dramatically, but constantly, their presence becoming part of the daily landscape, like stone and smoke. And when they pass you feel their attention not because you are suspected of anything in particular, but because suspicion itself has become the city's natural state, and anyone who seems slightly out of place is, by definition, a possible problem. One evening, when the cold is sharp enough to slow even the movement of smoke, you hear for the first time of people taken during the night, not officially and not with explanation, but quietly removed from their rooms by men who knew exactly where to knock and whom to take, and by morning those doors remain closed, and neighbours speak of it only in whispers, with a rigid caution that communicates more than any complete account ever could. You do not know whether the stories are true, and you do not know who has been taken or why, but the idea settles inside you heavily and without warmth, because once people can disappear without explanation, the city stops being merely difficult to survive and becomes a place capable of swallowing you whole without leaving a trace. And still life continues, because it must, because the alternatives are too large to face directly, and so you wake each morning, pull on shoes stiff with cold, descend the slick staircases, go to the workshop, and set your hands to familiar motions, because as long as your body moves in ways it understands, your mind can postpone questions it is not ready to answer. Edinburgh breathes more heavily now, but it still breathes, and you breathe with it, aware that the city is approaching a point from which it cannot return, even if no one says it aloud, even if everyone hopes silently and desperately to be among those who pass through the coming storm without being noticed. Hunger announces itself quietly at first, not with collapse or drama, but through faces that seem subtly altered from one day to the next, cheeks a little more hollow, eyes a little more watchful, movements a little more deliberate, as if everyone in the city has begun conserving energy without ever speaking about it, instinctively adjusting to the knowledge that food is no longer guaranteed in the way it once pretended to be. In the mornings you notice it on the stairs before you notice it in yourself, the way people pause more often as they climb, the way hands grip the stone railing longer than necessary, the way breathing sounds heavier in enclosed spaces, because the tenements do not forgive weakness, and the vertical city demands effort from bodies already running short on fuel. At the workshop, meals are spoken of more frequently but shared less, not out of cruelty, but because scarcity narrows generosity, and even kind men begin to calculate portions without meaning to, cutting bread more carefully, finishing bowls completely, leaving nothing behind that might once have been ignored, because waste now feels like an accusation. Mr. Crawford dismisses one of the younger boys quietly one afternoon, not with anger, not with spectacle, but with a few words spoken behind a closed door, and the boy leaves carrying his bundle without protest. Because everyone understands what has happened, that fewer hands mean fewer mouths, and that in winter, a business that feeds sentiment instead of reason does not survive. No one asks where the boy will go because the answer is too large and too bleak to be useful, and by the next morning his pallet has already been claimed by someone else. Proof that the city wastes nothing, not even absence. Agnes tells you that prices have risen again, not suddenly but enough that her mistress has begun skipping meals in the evenings, insisting she is not hungry, insisting she ate earlier, and Agnes does not argue because arguing does not create food, it only creates guilt, which serves no one. You find yourself thinking more often about the body, about what it requires to keep moving, about how much work can be done on how little fuel, about how the city seems designed to extract labor without regard for replacement, stair by stair, day by day, until the body learns to endure on less than it should. Rumors harden into warnings now, spoken plainly among those who trust one another. Stories of bakeries watched too closely, of men questioned about where they came from and why they lingered, of names written down and remembered, because authority has begun to fear movement, and fear always tightens its grip on those who cannot disappear. At night, the city sounds different, quieter but sharper, footsteps echoing longer on frozen stone, doors closing earlier, laughter shorter and less frequent, because even taverns lose their warmth when coin runs thin and worry runs deep. You lie awake more often, listening not just to the familiar noises of breathing and shifting straw, but for sounds that do not belong, footsteps that pause too long outside a door, voices that stop suddenly, the soft knock that arrives when no knock should, and you understand now why people speak less, why they avoid attention, why survival has become less about strength and more about invisibility. And yet, despite everything, people still wake, still dress, still work, still climb the stairs and descend them again, because the habit of living is powerful, because routine offers the illusion of control, and because as long as the city continues to function at even a reduced pace, it allows its inhabitants to believe that endurance will be enough. You begin to realize that Edinburgh is no longer simply a place where history happens in distant halls or on distant battlefields, but a place where history is pressing inward from all sides, reshaping daily life quietly and relentlessly, forcing choices that once could be avoided, and turning ordinary people into participants, whether they wish to be or not. And as winter deepens and the margins grow thinner, the city does not cry out or resist, but tightens itself further, waiting, as if aware that what comes next will not ask permission, and that survival will soon demand more than patience alone. Fear becomes practical before it becomes visible, slipping into daily habits and small decisions so gently that you barely notice it happening, until one evening you realize you now choose your routes home based not on distance but on light, on which closes still show a glow behind their windows, and which ones have gone dark too early. Because darkness no longer means sleep but absence, and absence has begun to mean danger. People stop asking questions that once felt harmless, like where someone is from or how long they've lived in the city, because answers now carry implications, and even curiosity can sound like accusation when repeated by the wrong mouth. So conversations narrow to weather, to work, to things already known, and anything uncertain is left untouched like a bruise that might hurt if pressed. You see it in Agnes as well. Not in fear exactly, but in caution, in the way she listens more than she speaks, in the way her eyes flick briefly towards stairwells and doorways before she says anything of consequence, and when she tells you that 2 men from her floor have left without explanation, their rooms emptied and sealed by the landlord before the week was out, she does so calmly, as if calm itself were a form of protection. At the workshop, the benches feel closer together, not because they have moved, but because the room is fuller now, more bodies competing for the same warmth, the same light, the same assurance that work tomorrow will still exist. and you sense the quiet tension in the way hands move faster, in the way mistakes are corrected sharply and without patience because error has become a luxury no one can afford. The soldiers grow bolder as winter deepens, stopping men in the street for reasons that are never fully explained, asking questions that have no correct answers, watching faces more than words, and when you pass them you keep your gaze steady and your pace even, because drawing attention feels like an invitation you cannot refuse once extended. One night, as snow falls thick enough to soften the sound of footsteps, there is shouting in a nearby close, brief and sharp, followed by silence that feels heavier than noise ever could, and the next morning you notice that the shutters on one window have been nailed shut from the outside, the wood raw and pale against the dark stone, a sign so clear it needs no explanation, and no one speaks of it as they pass. Hunger sharpens tempers now, not into open violence, but into brittle impatience, into arguments that flare and vanish just as quickly, into eyes that linger too long on bread baskets and bowls, because scarcity has begun to rearrange priorities, pushing kindness to the margins, and pulling survival into the center of every thought. You feel it in yourself as well, the way your body wakes already tired, the way your hands tremble slightly before warming to their tasks, the way food occupies more of your thoughts than it ever did before, not as pleasure, but as necessity, as calculation, as something to be protected once acquired. And yet, even as fear tightens and hunger presses in, there are moments that resist it, small and stubborn, like Agnes leaving a piece of bread wrapped in cloth on the stair one morning without a word, or Duncan insisting on carrying water himself despite the strain, or an old woman in the close nodding at you with quiet recognition, as if acknowledging that endurance itself is a shared language in this place. You begin to understand that Edinburgh is not waiting for a single moment of collapse or revelation, but for a slow crossing, a point where enough people decide, consciously or not, that the rules have changed, that safety is no longer guaranteed by obedience or silence, and that survival will soon demand choices that cannot be undone. The city holds itself tightly now, like a breath drawn and not yet released, and you move within it carefully, aware that history is no longer something happening elsewhere, but something moving closer with each day of cold, each empty loaf, each door that closes and does not reopen, and that when it finally arrives fully, it will not announce itself with ceremony, but with consequences. The days shorten until the light feels like something rationed, doled out sparingly by a sky that has learned the city will endure without complaint, and you begin to measure time not by clocks or bells, but by how long your fingers remain numb before they remember how to move, by how many breaths it takes, before the cold loosens its grip on your chest each morning. Work becomes steadier in its demands, and harsher in its consequences, because orders no longer arrive with politeness or patience, but with urgency, men wanting their wigs repaired or replaced not for ceremony but for necessity, for court appearances and petitions and moments where appearance might mean the difference between suspicion and safety. And Mr. Crawford allows no delays, no excuses, because reputation is the only shield a tradesman has when power shifts without warning. You notice that people age faster now, not in years but in posture, in the way shoulders curve inward and steps grow cautious, and even laughter sounds restrained, as if joy itself might draw unwanted attention. And when someone does laugh too loudly in a tavern or a close, it carries a nervous edge, followed by silence that falls too quickly to feel natural. Agnes speaks less of her mistress and more of logistics, of where letters are stored, of which cupboards contain valuables and which can be abandoned if flight becomes necessary, and though she never says the word escape, it hangs between you like a shared understanding, shaping every plan and every pause in conversation. At night the city settles unevenly, with some streets falling silent early, while others remain restless until dawn, and you learn to read the difference between ordinary noise and the sound of something wrong, the sharp cry that ends too abruptly, the heavy steps that do not follow a familiar rhythm, the sudden stillness that spreads outward like ripples on dark water. You dream differently now, less of people and more of places, stairwells that twist endlessly downward, doors that open onto rooms already emptied, streets that lead you back to the same square no matter which way you turn, and you wake with the sense that the city itself has been rearranging its interior, preparing for something that has not yet arrived but already feels inevitable. Food grows scarcer as winter deepens, not because there is none, but because it moves differently now, redirected toward those with authority, or hoarded by those with means, leaving everyone else to negotiate scraps and favors and debts that will never be repaid. And you begin to understand how hunger can erode dignity quietly, without drama, until need feels more honest than pride ever did. Still, there are moments of quiet resistance, like the baker who slips an extra heel of bread into a child's hands and pretends not to notice, or the water carrier who waits until nightfall to deliver full buckets to certain doors without charge, or the way people look out for one another without acknowledgement, because acknowledgement would make kindness visible, and visibility has become dangerous. You hear names whispered more often now, names of men taken for questioning, and not yet returned, names of households marked by visits in the night, names spoken softly, and then not spoken again, and each disappearance leaves behind a gap that the city quickly fills, because space is always needed, and absence is never allowed to linger. Agnes tells you one evening, her voice low and steady, that her mistress has decided to leave sooner than planned, not because of a single threat, but because waiting has begun to feel more dangerous than movement. And as she says this, she watches your face carefully, not for reassurance but for understanding, because understanding is the only thing she asks of you now. You realize then that survival is no longer about enduring hardship but about timing, about knowing when to stay invisible, and when to move quickly, when to hold on, and when to let go, and that these decisions will not come with certainty, only with consequences that must be accepted without regret. The city feels tighter with each passing day, as if its stone walls are slowly drawing inward, compressing lives and choices into narrower spaces, and you move through it with growing awareness that what you are living is no longer merely difficult, but transitional, a threshold between what was and what will be, and once crossed, nothing will return to its former shape. The change does not arrive with thunder or proclamation, but with a morning that feels wrong before you can name why. A morning where the bells ring out of sequence and voices carry too far through the cold air, and when you step into the street, you sense it immediately in the way people stand still, instead of moving, clustered in doorways and at corners, listening for something they cannot yet see. Word spreads the way it always does in Edinburgh, not quickly but thoroughly, passing mouth to mouth, distorted slightly by fear and urgency, until the shape of it becomes clear enough to weigh on everyone at once, because the army is closer now, not somewhere beyond the hills or marching through towns with names you've never seen, but near enough that roads are closing, that wagons are being turned back, that men who left days ago are already returning with faces tight and eyes wide. Mr. Crawford shuts the shop without argument, locking the door with hands that do not tremble, because experience has taught him that hesitation costs more than decisiveness ever will. And he tells you and the others to go home early, not as kindness but as caution, because empty streets are safer than crowded ones when power is uncertain. As you climb the stairwell, you hear movement in places that are usually quiet at this hour, hurried packing, drawers opening and closing, whispered conversations that stop abruptly when someone passes, and the building feels alive in a way that is almost animal, as if it too understands that remaining still is no longer an option. Agnes meets you on the landing without pretense, her coat already on, her hair covered, a small bundle at her feet that holds everything she intends to take with her, and when she looks at you there is no panic in her eyes, only resolve sharpened by necessity, because fear has burned itself down to something usable. They came last night, she says, meaning the soldiers, though she does not use the word, because words feel dangerous now, and she tells you they asked questions that sounded casual, but were anything but about visitors and letters and who had come and gone during the occupation, and though her mistress answered carefully, It was enough to convince them that waiting longer would only invite worse. You stand there together in the narrow space between floors, surrounded by stone and wood that has heard centuries of departures, and you understand without saying it that this is not a moment meant to be stretched or softened, that whatever you say now must be simple enough to survive memory, because memory is all it may have left. Agnes presses something into your hand, a small folded scrap of paper no larger than your palm, and tells you not to open it here, not because someone is watching, but because this place no longer belongs to you. See? And then she steps closer, close enough that the cold no longer reaches between you, and she tells you to live, not as a wish but as an instruction. When she leaves, her footsteps echo longer than they should, each one striking the stone like a mark being made and not erased, and you remain where you are until the sound fades completely, because moving too soon feels like betrayal, even though you know staying forever would be worse. The city shifts as the day unfolds, patrols increasing, wagons rattling through streets already strained by winter, doors closing that have never closed before, and by evening the air feels heavy with inevitability, like a storm that does not rush but cannot be avoided. You return to your room and sit on your pallet without removing your coat, holding Agnes's paper unopened, because part of you believes that as long as it remains folded, the future has not yet chosen its shape, and you listen to the sounds of Edinburgh tightening around itself, the murmurs and movements of people making the same calculations you are. When you finally unfold the paper, you find only an address and a name, written carefully, as if steadiness itself could be transferred through ink, and nothing else. No promise, no explanation, no farewell, just a place that exists somewhere beyond this city, and a reminder that survival sometimes leaves breadcrumbs rather than paths. That night, sleep comes in fragments, interrupted by shouts and distant boots and the uneasy silence that follows them, and when morning arrives it brings with it a clarity that feels almost cruel, because you understand now that surviving Edinburgh is no longer about enduring what is happening here, but about deciding whether here will still be enough. The decision settles slowly, not as a dramatic turning point, but as a quiet alignment of thoughts and circumstances, the kind that happens when endurance finally gives way to understanding, and you realize that survival is not always about staying, but about knowing when the place that shaped you can no longer hold the life you are becoming. In the days that follow, Edinburgh resumes its familiar rhythms with unsettling ease, as if nothing has happened at all, as if soldiers have not knocked on doors in the night, as if names have not vanished from stairwells and market stalls, as if fear has not threaded itself into every ordinary exchange. And this return to routine feels stranger than chaos ever did, because it asks you to pretend that the city has not shown you its teeth. You keep working at the bench, your hands steady now from years of repetition, shaping horsehair into careful curls, dusting powder that clings to your skin and clothes no matter how often you wash. And Mr. Crawford nods more often these days, trusting you with finer work, more visible commissions, the kind that suggest you are no longer just an apprentice, but something closer to indispensable. And that realization brings pride, but also a weight, because roots are hardest to pull up just when they begin to take hold. At night you climb to the top of the tenement when you can, standing where the wind cuts cleanly across the rooftops, looking out over the dense sprawl of stone and slate, the castle still perched on its ancient rock, the city breathing beneath it, as it has for centuries, wounded but unbroken, cruel and sheltering in equal measure, and you understand that Edinburgh will go on without you, just as it has gone on without so many others. You think of Malcolm, of the choices he made and the price he paid, of Agnes walking away into a future you cannot see, of Duncan sleeping peacefully now, his breath slow and even, of William still reading, still searching for meaning in words written long before this city existed. And you see how each of you has been shaped differently by the same narrow streets and heavy walls. The paper Agnes left becomes worn at the edges from being unfolded and refolded, carried close to your body like something alive, not a promise but a possibility. And you do not decide to leave all at once, but piece by piece, allowing the idea to exist first, then to grow, then to feel less like betrayal and more like continuation. When spring finally returns, tentative and pale, softening the sharpest edges of the city, you give notice quietly, following the rules, doing everything properly, because you have learned that order, when possible, is its own kind of protection. And Mr. Crawford listens without interruption before nodding once, the same nod he gives when a piece of work is done well, as if he understands that apprentices are not meant to stay forever, that survival sometimes means moving on before the walls close in again. Your last morning comes without ceremony, the city waking as it always does, bells ringing, carts rattling, voices rising from closes that will soon forget your name, and you walk the streets one final time, committing small details to memory, the worn steps, the familiar smells, the way light falls unevenly between buildings, knowing that this place will live inside you long after you have left it behind. As you pass through the gate and feel the road open beneath your feet, the air shifts just slightly, enough to remind you that the world is larger than stone walls and stacked lives, and you carry Edinburgh with you not as a burden but as proof. Proof that you endured cold and hunger and fear. Proof that you learned how to survive before you learned how to hope. And somewhere ahead, beyond the next bend in the road, there is a place that does not yet know you. A place where your past will matter only as much as you allow it to. And as you walk toward it, the city fades behind you, still standing, still breathing, still surviving, while you do the same, one step at a time, into a future that is uncertain, but finally, unmistakably your own.